Inside the Byzantine imperial palace at Constantinople, the soldier standing nearest the emperor's own bedchamber was almost never a Greek. He was a foreigner, often from 1,000 miles to the north, and he carried a weapon built for one purpose: ending a fight before it reached the emperor at all. That weapon was a two-handed axe, long enough to break a shield wall and heavy enough to cut through mail in a single stroke, and it stayed close at hand, whether the guardsman was standing ceremonial duty or riding out with the army on campaign. For 4 centuries, from the late 10th century into the 15th, this foreign-born force stood at the center of Byzantine survival, hired specifically because its members owed nothing to any faction inside the empire. Their story runs through a Kievan prince's gift of 6,000 warriors, a weapon built for a very particular kind of violence, an institution that changed shape and origin more than once without ever losing its purpose, and a stone lion in Venice that still carries their names today. The unit's formal start is usually dated to the year 988, but the emperor's need went back further than that. Basil II, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, had spent most of the previous decade fighting his own generals. One of them, a commander named Bardas Phocas, led a rebellion so severe that rebel troops reached the shore of the Bosphorus Strait within sight of the capital, and Basil's own throne was in serious danger. An emperor who cannot trust his own army needs soldiers who owe it nothing. Basil sent word to Vladimir, Prince of the Kievan Rus, a Slavic and Scandinavian-influenced state built around trade routes linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Vladimir agreed to send 6,000 warriors south in exchange for marrying Basil's own sister and converting his people to Christianity. He was also, by several accounts, glad to be rid of troops he could not otherwise pay or control. Selection for these recruits weighed physical size and proven fighting skill, but the deciding factor was always the same one that made the whole arrangement work in the first place: no local family, no local faction, and therefore nothing at home to divide their loyalty. In the year 989, those Rus warriors landed at Chrysopolis under Basil's own command. Bardas Phocas collapsed and died of a stroke in full view of his own soldiers, and his rebellion broke apart on the spot. Basil had his throne back, and he had learned something in the process. These foreign troops fought without hesitation for a cause that was never their own to begin with, and they had done it at the single moment his own countrymen's loyalty could not be counted on. He kept them on, gave them a larger share of captured plunder than his regular Byzantine soldiers received on the very next campaign against Bulgaria, and began recruiting them as a standing institution rather than a one-time favor. Pay, land grants, and a share of plunder became the price of that loyalty, renewed with every new recruit for the next 400 years, long after Basil himself, and eventually Vladimir's own dynasty, were gone. What made this force distinct was not just where its soldiers came from, it was what they carried. Byzantine and Norse sources describe a two-handed axe with a crescent-shaped head, roughly 18 centimeters across, mounted on a haft between 1 and 2 meters long. That length gave a guardsman reach no sword could match, room enough to break a shield wall from outside an opponent's own striking distance, swung with both hands and a wide stance rather than braced behind a shield. A single solid strike could cut through mail. The same weapon, in the wrong hands, was too slow to recover between swings, which is exactly why it took years of dedicated training rather than general soldiering to use well. Guardsmen typically carried a second, shorter axe at the belt as backup, useful once an opponent closed the distance the long haft was built to prevent. This is not just a detail from chronicle description. Archaeologists have recovered Scandinavian-style axe heads in Greece and in Western Anatolia, alongside Anglo-Saxon-style sword fittings in the same regions. Physical confirmation that these foreign weapons, and later the foreign soldiers who replaced the first wave of Scandinavians, did travel with their owners across the empire. Their equipment did not stay frozen in time. Early recruits arrived in typical Scandinavian gear: long mail shirts, conical helmets, round combat shields. Over the generations that followed, guardsmen increasingly adopted Byzantine kit instead: lamella corselets built from overlapping armored plates, and crested helmets in the imperial style. Archaeological finds show hybrid armor sets, mixing both traditions in the same period, sometimes on the same soldier, proof that this was a living military unit adapting to a new environment rather than a single unchanging image of a Viking warrior held in place for 400 years. That adaptation ran in both directions. Once Anglo-Saxon exiles began arriving in large numbers after 1066, their own equipment and sword styles entered the same archaeological record, layered on top of the Scandinavian gear and the Byzantine kit that came before it. Their duties were not limited to standing near a throne. Byzantine administrative practice split the Varangians of the city, as they were known when not on campaign, across several distinct jobs: bodyguards at the entrance to the emperor's own reception hall and bedchamber, jailers and police within Constantinople, guards posted at the city's churches and palaces, and when the army marched, elite shock infantry deployed at the decisive point in a field battle. Some also served as sailors, alongside the Byzantine fleet, a role suited to men who had crossed open water to reach Constantinople in the first place. Anna Komnene, the emperor's own daughter, wrote decades later in her history of her father's reign that these axe-bearing men treated loyalty to the emperor's person as, in her words, an inherited pledge passed from father to son that they would not break for any bribe. Her book was written to celebrate her father's rule, not to give an outside verdict on his guards, but even a flattering court history preserved a specific detail. This loyalty was structural, built into the institution's design, not simply a matter of personal character. The clearest evidence that this reputation was earned rather than invented later sits today outside the arsenal in Venice, thousands of miles from Scandinavia and hundreds of miles from Constantinople itself. The marble lion in question dates to the 4th century BC, when it stood guard at Piraeus, the harbor of Athens, already more than 1,000 years old by the time any Varangian ever saw it. Sometime in the last quarter of the 11th century, a Scandinavian member of the Varangian Guard carved runes into its shoulder and flank, names including Harold, Asmund, and Halfdan, wrapped in a serpent-like design matching runestone traditions from upland in Sweden. Nobody in Venice recognized the carving as runic for nearly 700 years. To everyone who walked past it, the marks were just weathering on old stone. Scandinavian scholars first identified the script around 1798, and it took another century of runology, serious academic work by the historian Carl Christian Raffen in the 1800s, and the runologist Erik Brahe in 1914, before scholars could read enough of it to connect it confidently to the Guard. The lion itself was looted from Piraeus to Venice in 1687, an old war trophy carrying an even older one inside it without anyone realizing. Its runes remain the closest thing to a signature these guardsmen ever left behind, carved by men who had no reason to think anyone would ever go looking for them. The record in open battle backs up what the runes suggest. At Manzikert in 1071, as the wider Byzantine army broke apart around him and the Seljuk Turks pressed the collapse, the Varangian Guard held its position around Emperor Romanos IV rather than retreat, even as the empire's other forces scattered and the emperor himself was ultimately captured. A decade later at Dyrrhachium in 1081, an outnumbered Guard, by then increasingly made up of Anglo-Saxon exiles rather than Scandinavians, held its line against Norman cavalry under Robert Guiscard long enough to slow an entire invasion in a country far from the one those same exiles had lost 15 years earlier to a different Norman army entirely. Neither battle ended in victory. Both left the same impression on the historians who recorded them. Whatever else could be said about these foreign soldiers and whatever equipment or homeland they happened to carry into a given decade, they did not break first. The unit's purpose was always to give an emperor soldiers he could trust completely, drawn from far enough away and equipped distinctly enough that no local faction could claim them as its own. And for more than 2 centuries that arrangement held. It did not survive the empire's own collapse. In 1204, Crusader armies, fellow Christians rather than a foreign enemy, broke into Constantinople itself. Varangians, by then predominantly Anglo-Saxon rather than Scandinavian, fought at the walls as the city's political leadership came apart around them. The same specialized weapon and the same imported loyalty turned against an enemy nobody had built the institution to face. The Guard continued in name after the Byzantines recaptured their capital in 1261, but at a fraction of its former size and standing, and the last recorded mention of English axe-bearing guards in Byzantine service comes from the chronicler Adam of Usk, as late as 1404, more than 400 years after Vladimir's warriors first landed at Chrysopolis. What survives of them now is mostly stone and steel, an axe head recovered from foreign soil, a lion's shoulder in Venice, carved by a hand that expected no one to read it 7 centuries later. Whoever cut those runes was simply marking that he had been there. He had no way of knowing it would become nearly the only voice this institution left in its own words.